and entertain.
Tonight on Talking Politics, it's Milton versus Massachusetts after voters in that town chose to defy a major state housing law. Now, the Healey administration is threatening legal action and could pull some state funding. But first, it has been 2 years since Russia launched its latest invasion of Ukraine. And since then, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed as the country tries to fend off Kremlin forces. Now, Ukrainian leaders say they desperately need more support to keep up the fight. But here in the U.S., House Republicans are refusing to bring the latest aid package up for a vote.
History is watching. Failure to support Ukraine at this critical moment will never be forgotten.
The $95 billion bill, which passed in the Senate earlier this week, also includes funding for Israel and Taiwan. Massachusetts Congressman Jake Auchincloss joins me now to discuss that and more. Congressman, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Can we talk through the back and forth between the Senate and the House on foreign aid and the border? Because I personally find it dizzying to try to keep track of what's going on here. Tell me if I've got this right. The Senate was going to pass a bill linking $95 billion in foreign aid to increased border security. House Speaker Mike Johnson said that he would not allow a vote on that. Then the Senate passed a bill dealing with foreign aid in isolation, and House Speaker Mike Johnson said he wouldn't bring it to a vote because it didn't include border security. Have I got the broad contours right there?
You do, and what's distressing is that Speaker Johnson appears to be even more confused than you are, despite being in the driver's seat on this. It's very complicated. The parliamentary maneuvers are dizzying, but actually it's very simple. This is about Donald Trump having consumed the Republican Party. And a lot of House and Senate Republicans who know better, who will tell their colleagues privately that they want to support Ukraine, are afraid of a primary challenge. And so they're not willing to stick their neck out. That's really what it comes down to, is Donald Trump's isolationism, his pro-Putin sympathies have corroded the final vestiges of the Reagan wing of the Republican Party. And what that means is we have members of Congress and administration officials heading to the Munich Security Conference right now. Munich Security Conference is the premier opportunity for European and American defense ministers and other senior officials to come together and talk about Atlantic security. They're heading there, and they're doing so able to bring nothing for the Ukrainian fight against Russia. The United States looks weak right now on the world stage, and that is entirely Speaker Johnson's fault.
So have your colleagues in the House told you that they either have been lobbied by former President Trump or that they would like to support this but fear a primary challenge? They've said that explicitly?
Yeah, and I mean, yes, but they also don't need to say that explicitly because it's very clear to see the dynamic. Donald Trump says the quiet part out loud. One thing he is not is subtle. He said, don't fix the border. I need to campaign on this. Mm-hmm. And so Mitch McConnell, within the space of 24 hours, turned around and said, we can't do the border now, took the border out, came to the House, and Speaker Johnson, who was afraid of putting Ukraine on the floor for a vote, is now trying to confabulate that he needs the border in there. All of the kind of manipulations and confabulations are frankly not the point. The point is Donald Trump dominates this party. Donald Trump is against Ukraine. Donald Trump wants to campaign on the border, not govern on the border, and they're all following suit.
When I was driving in today before you and I had this conversation, I heard on NPR a report that Mike Johnson has now indicated to the Biden administration that he may, in fact, put this bill up for a vote. Is that something that you're hearing as well, that he may be tacking yet again back in a different direction?
Mike Johnson is playing chess against himself and he's losing. I've worked in business, I've worked in local government, I've worked in Congress, I've worked in nonprofit, I've worked in the military. I have never seen leadership that is less decisive than what Mike Johnson brings to the House floor. Being Speaker of the House means counting to 218. It means calling a play and then executing that play. And Mike Johnson, whether it's FISA reauthorization for national security intelligence, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is border, whether it is funding the government, has consistently said one thing, said the other thing, and done nothing. And it's becoming a national security threat.
What are the implications going to be for Ukraine if this about, I believe, $60 billion in aid that this legislation would provide is not forthcoming?
They could lose this year. And I want to be very clear about where this war stands right now. Ukraine has the willpower to win, but it needs the firepower to win. And the United States is the only country in the world that can provide that firepower. European nations have stepped up. They have provided, in monetary terms, even more than the United States has to Ukraine, but they don't have the same military-industrial complex that we have here in the United States. We are the only country capable of sending the material that Ukraine needs to win. And that material that we are sending is a boost for our own industry here at home. Massachusetts, for example, has gotten more than $1 billion in investment that is creating jobs and is strengthening our industrial base in order to ship those supplies to Ukraine. So this is actually an investment here at home that is also aiding the fight for freedom overseas.
I want to ask you about some other legislation that's working its way or possibly working its way through Congress right now. The tax relief bill that was passed by the House that would do a whole bunch of things. I can't summarize them all here, but I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, would expand the child tax credit, expand the low-income tax credit, provide some corporate tax breaks. My understanding is that in this case, the House is on board with that legislation. It's been passed, but now Senate Republicans are pumping the brakes on it. Is that correct?
Yes, and if I could, let's just dig in a little bit more into the policy, because I think it's particularly important for Massachusetts. This bill does 4 things broadly. One is it fixes a taxation issue with Taiwan and Taiwan's investment in the United States. And that is important because we want Taiwan investing, particularly in semiconductor manufacturing and R&D here at home. The other 3 things it does is housing, R&D, and the child tax credit. It expands a very successful bipartisan program to produce more affordable housing. Massachusetts' #1 challenge right now is lack of affordable housing. This program directly hits on the supply side for more affordable housing. Number 2, it expands the child tax credit. That puts money in the pockets of working families. Something on the order of 150,000 families in Massachusetts would benefit from that directly. And then number 3 is it fixes a mistake made under the Trump tax cuts of 2017 that made it less attractive for companies, particularly biotech companies, to do research and development. Well, you know, biotech R&D is obviously a mainstay for the Massachusetts economy. So this bill is a huge win for the Bay State. I was a big advocate for it. And you're right that Senate Republicans are pumping the brakes. Some of that is, you know, the healthy dynamic between 2 chambers. Both chambers want to have a say in it. And so I'm not distressed about the ability for this thing to pass. And frankly, these days, the House is the bigger hurdle than the Senate because of the speakership.
That's why I was surprised that there might be some resistance in the Senate, because I think of the Senate as more inclined to collaborate in a bipartisan way. And this, we should note, passed the House by an incredibly wide bipartisan margin. You mentioned biotech a couple times in your comments so far. You were here in Boston, I believe last week with, and tell me, I haven't been able to figure out, is the name of it the House Select Committee on China or the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party? I want to make sure I got it right.
Formally, it's the latter.
Okay.
And you're right that on Monday, the committee came to Boston and Cambridge for field hearings on biotech, because biotech is a significant domain of competition between the Chinese and the Americans. The Chinese are making big investments in biotech. Some of that is salutary. They're funding more postdoc positions. They're funding more basic research. That's good. We want countries to do that. Some of it is nefarious. They are harvesting genetic information without consent, deeply unethical and alarming, frankly, because some of these companies are part of a civil-military fusion complex that could even weaponize some of this information.
Yeah, that's very ominous. You wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe arguing that there are certain things that the United States can and should do to respond as the gap between China and the U.S. on biotech gets closer. You described the U.S. as still being in the lead in that sector, but you say the gap is narrowing. What are the things that you'd like to see the U.S. do in response, starting with immigration policy?
Yeah, 3 big things. So first of all, talent. The physician scientist, the biomedical entrepreneur is really the maven of innovation in the biotech ecosystem. And we need to be, one, of course, educating those people here in the Bay State and the United States more broadly, but we also have to be attracting them. And right now we've got this conundrum where people are coming to the United States to get their PhD, they're coming here to do postdoc research, and then they're leaving. And they're leaving because our visa system is so entangled. There are reforms that can happen through the administration and without Congress through what's called Schedule A Group 1, that basically expedites visas for very narrow specialties that are highly in demand. And I think we need to add a number of slots from the biomedical community to that list, in addition to doing comprehensive immigration reform, as Democrats have repeatedly tried to do, as I've been trying to do through the Dignity Act and other legislation. Number 1A under attracting high-skilled immigration talent is also just better funding that talent when they're here. Unfortunately, scientists are waiting until their early 40s to get NIH grants. And that can be very dispiriting for young scientists. We need to do a better job, both through the NIH and through nonprofit funders, of helping young scientists get that first grant, get their first lab set up, helping mid-career pivoters who have high-risk contrarian ideas. They're really the seeds of breakthroughs. We got to do a better job of helping to fund those talented, high-risk ideas.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just to round it out. Number 2, our federal policy needs to reward makers, not takers. People who build new things, whether it's medical devices or drugs or new services, they should be rewarded. We want those people building those things that improve health spans and help with caregiving and give people hope after a dread diagnosis. But then there are also takers. There are agents in the healthcare system in the United States who are abusing regulation or their market position to just take. One example are these pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen of drug pricing owned by health insurance companies, who take $250 billion out of our healthcare system every year and add precious little back. And I've got legislation to really crack down on that kind of taking. Third thing, very briefly, just infrastructure for the biotech community. How do we make clinical trials faster and more diverse? How do we provide standardization of terminology and weights and measures? Boring stuff, not necessarily glamorous or eye-catching, but the kind of things that propel the United States forward in this global industry.
I want to ask you, before we wrap up, briefly about Israel's war with Hamas. But before I do that, I want to flash back to Russia for a moment. It has been reported that the White House sees a troubling new anti-satellite weapon being developed by Russia. We also happen to be talking on a day when it's been reported that the former opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, has died in prison in Russia. Do you have any thoughts on either of those two developments and what they portend for the future of U.S.-Russia relations?
Both are grisly examples of Russia's continued regression from international norms and conventions. They are seeking to disrupt and upend the rules-based international order that the United States helped architect after World War II. And unfortunately, there is a vocal, muscular, but minority position within the United States Congress that wants to appease Vladimir Putin. Appeasement does not work. The funds that the United States has given to Ukraine, it's less than 10% of our federal defense spending, has been the highest return on investment in national security dollars in my entire lifetime. We have cratered more than half of Russia's military capacity. We have doubled its border with NATO. We have sent a strong message of unity and strength from NATO to the rest of the world, including Beijing and Tehran. This has been a successful 2 years of support for a close ally. But to cut and run now would be to negate those efforts, and it would be to invite a larger conflict within the very heart of Europe. We must stand strong against Vladimir Putin.
Finally, today, I wanted to ask you about a shift in your delegation by one of your colleagues when it comes to the question of whether a ceasefire might be appropriate in the war between Israel and Hamas. I did a roundup of where various members of the delegation currently stand on that question, and most people seem to be in the place that they had been a couple months back, whether it was pro or con. But your colleague Steve Lynch, who I thought of at the outset, right after Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, I thought of him as, along with you, one of the most robust pro-Israel voices. He has now come out in support of a ceasefire. And I want to read a little bit of the tweet where he explained his shift in position. He wrote, "While I respect and support the right of Israel to protect its citizens and respond forcefully to the savage attacks of this past October 7th, the military operation against Hamas in Gaza has now reached a stage whose primary object appears to be wreaking vengeance against innocent Palestinian civilians, mostly children." I'm wondering if you, as this war continues, have any concerns about Israel's current military approach, and if you think that Israel's military approach, as it stands right now, might make a two-state solution, which I know you support, more difficult to attain down the road.
War is a nightmare. I've seen it firsthand, and this is a nightmare scenario. It was in a scenario that was brought upon this region by Hamas and its barbaric attacks of October 7th against Israel. Israel, in its response, has an obligation to obey the law of armed conflict, and it also has the responsibility to return the hostages that have been taken. More than 100 of those hostages remain in the bowels of the terror tunnels that Hamas constructed over the last 15 years instead of constructing clean water infrastructure and healthcare facilities for the Palestinian people to use. The primary objective needs to be to return those hostages, some of whom are as young as 1 year old and are still being held underground in conditions that are unimaginable. Of course, I want this conflict to stop. Everybody of good conscience wants this conflict to stop. But we want this conflict to stop in a way that is sustainable. And stopping short of demilitarizing the Strip, stopping short of returning the hostages, only guarantees that we perpetuate this cycle of violence. Hamas walked through the last ceasefire on October 7th. It has guaranteed the world that it will walk through the next ceasefire. That's coming from the Hamas commander himself. And we need to believe them when they say that. And so we need to eradicate Hamas's leadership. We need to return the hostages, and we need to transition to post-war governance in Gaza that delivers competent civil services and economic development to the 2.2 million people, half of whom are children in that region.
All right, Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you for taking all this time. I appreciate it.
Good evening.
Next up, the town of Milton has voted to defy state law and reject new zoning rules mandated by the MBTA Communities Act, which aims to build more multifamily housing in cities and towns near T-stops. Town officials approved the new rules in December, but residents forced a referendum, and the opponents won.
Very disappointed in the vote.
In response, the state is threatening legal action and saying that Milton's putting its state funding at risk. So what is going to happen next? And what does all of this mean for the state's housing crisis? Joining me are GBH News transportation reporter Bob C. and Boston Globe columnist and Milton resident Shirley Leung. Thank you both for being here. So Shirley, as I just mentioned, you live in Milton. You've been writing about this. Can you start by explaining what specifically was voted down this week? Because it wasn't that Milton said, we're not going to comply with this law, period. What did Milton vote down?
So there was a group of residents who put this on the ballot, and it was a Valentine's Day election, and we all went to the polls to answer one question: yes or no. Would we approve? The town meeting had in December had this plan to create 2,400 more multifamily housing units. Would we approve that zoning plan? And that was voted down. 54% of those who went to the polls voted it down. So a decisive victory for no. And you have to keep in mind, like, this issue was so huge. There were lawn signs, yes and no. It pitted neighbors against neighbors. You almost didn't want to ask your neighbor how they were voting because it was so contentious.
Why did the no side win?
They were very passionate, and many of them live in East Milton. And the way the zoning plan was proposed, most of the multifamily housing would go in their neighborhood. So they were concerned about congestion, maybe the impact on their property values. So those who would be most affected by the new zoning rules voted against it.
Now, I live north of the city, and I very much embody this fact that there's a split between people who live north and south of the city. So Milton's terra incognita to me. What differentiates East Milton from other parts of the city? I've read that it is already more congested. Is that true?
East Milton is the part of town that's closest to the 93 expressway. So if you're coming off the expressway and going into Milton, chances are you're driving through East Milton.
Okay.
So there's a lot of commerce on that side of town. I live on the other side of town, which is closer to the trolley, and we just don't have as much commercial area, and it's much more kind of traditional single-family residential.
I'm glad you brought up the trolley. We will get to that in a little bit, but not just yet. Bob C., can you take a step back and remind viewers what it is that this MBTA Communities Act does and doesn't do? What does it require communities, or I was going to say across the state, and it's not quite across the state, but we do have a map that we can bring up. There are a whole bunch of communities in the greater Boston area, in eastern Massachusetts, that have an obligation under this. There you see all the communities that are going to have to participate on one level or another. There are 4 tiers of participation, depending on the transit access that you have. But remind people, what does this law do?
Well, it's an extension, really, of what is a feeling that transit-oriented development is the way to go in terms of developing housing, because it puts people around transit access places where they can, more easily get back and forth to where they're going without having to drive. So this law really pertains to all 177 MBTA communities, those that receive service. But it first applies to 12 communities who receive the most service, the so-called rapid transit communities that have T service. So this is where the action's taking place right now.
And it requires, tell me if I've got this right, it requires communities to create one district in town where multifamily housing can be built by right. The density of that housing depends on how much access that community has. It's supposed to be near the T, the MBTA, broadly speaking, whether it's a bus stop or a commuter rail stop or a subway stop. And in that district, there can't be age restrictions on the multifamily units that are built, and they need to be family friendly. So not just geared towards singles, for example, and couples. Okay. Shirley, in your column after the vote, you urged the town of Milton, your hometown of Milton, to come up with a plan that the town can support. And I want to quote you. You wrote, "To those neighbors who voted no, please don't think of this as your Boston Tea Party. The state's not our colonial overlord. This is about working together to solve a housing crisis that threatens the state's economic future. It's about kids growing up in Milton being able to stay in their hometown when they have families. If we don't start building more homes, the young and talented will flock to more affordable states." But I found myself wondering, after I read that, I've seen quotes from people in Milton who were very happy with the no vote, who seem to think of this as their Boston Tea Party. So do the opponents in Milton who prevailed this week, do they want a different plan that will bring Milton in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, or do they want no plan at all and massive resistance to this act?
That remains to be seen. I mean, yes, I think some part of the no faction said we want a better plan. I think some people who voted no don't want to comply at all. And I wrote, now in full disclosure, I voted yes. And I'm urging yes and no sides to come together and come up with a plan, because there are consequences if Milton does not comply with the state law. Whether it's Attorney General Campbell, Andrea Joy Campbell, threatening to sue us, or Maura Healey has said she might cut off state funding.
Has she said she would cut off a lot of state funding, or she's kind of left it up to the imagination, right? Some state funding. of some type? We don't really know.
Well, the Healy administration has put out a list of potential grants they could withhold, and so
what's on the list?
A lot of it's like housing grants, but it's unclear. Like, would she go as far as cutting off school lunch program? Would she go as far as cutting off roads? We don't know at this point. So that's why I urged my fellow residents to get together, work with the planning board, come up with a plan as soon as possible.
Probably worth mentioning really quickly that this was a law passed by or under the administration of former Governor Charlie Baker. This is not a Maura Healey initiative. She's supportive of it. She's enforcing it, but she did not create it or spearhead it. Bob, we saw, as Shirley was making the point she just made, a picture of the somewhat unique transit entity in Milton that makes it one of the first communities that has to comply with this law. And for some of our viewers, they will have been looking at that orange train and saying, what is that? What is the mass transit entity that puts Milton at the top of the list here when it comes to compliance?
Well, it is the Mattapan trolley, which dates from the 1940s. Those cars are classics. They've been restored. And a lot of people in Milton might say, well, gee, that's not really rapid transit. But in fact, the MBTA considers it part of the Orange Line, and it is part of the rapid transit system, whether Milton residents agree or not. So that's what has elevated Milton to the eligibility or the requirement that it has to create this zoning.
Shirley, I see you wanting to hop in.
I was going to say, the cars are orange, but it actually feeds into the red line. It's a little confusing for riders, but that's another reason why being classified a rapid transit community versus maybe a commuter rail or adjacent, you had lower density requirements, that energized the no side.
And there was an effort made to get that classification, right? The lower classification with less building required.
Yes, and the state rejected that push.
I have been on the Mattapan trolley, I think, one time, taking it out to an interview, and I felt like I traveled back in time to 1950.
That is right.
It was really a very different.
It's a single trolley. People are like, is it like the Green Line, Shirley? I was like, no, it's not like the Green Line. It is literally it's like that Boston trolley that runs around town on wheels. It's just a single car.
And did you say, I want to be very clear about this, is the Mattapan trolley, as it comes through Milton, it is on the other side of town from where this new building district was proposed,
Yes,
right?
yes. So there's several districts where you can build more multifamily housing, and I think that's another thing that energized the no. Why are we are one of the parts of town that's furthest from the trolley.
Well, I could see that.
Why do we get hit with the biggest amount of housing?
That seems like a good question. Bob, you get the last word here very briefly. Depending on what the Healey administration and AG Campbell do here, could we see more communities following Milton's lead when they're not happy with the requirements being imposed on them for one reason or another, and basically saying, no, we're not going to go along with this law?
Well, that's the danger that this could undermine the whole act, the whole law, if in fact Milton succeeds in blocking it, because a lot of other communities are opposed to this zoning regulation as well, and they could take action if they're emboldened by what happens in Milton. So what happens in Milton is extremely important, and we really don't know yet. I mean, the governor and the attorney general have yet to react to the vote specifically in terms of what they will do, although they did threaten.
Sorry to cut you off. Well, as this plays out, come back. I'd love to have the two of you come back and talk this through, because it's fascinating. And as you just said, Bob, the stakes are pretty high. Bob C., Shirley Leung, thank you both. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Crimes are linked.